Okay, so we're on. So welcome. It's good to have some interaction with you all. You've just been kind of names and emails to me, so I'm glad that you're here. And my number one goal is to answer any questions that you have. So I'm going to do a review session, but if there's any topic in particular you want me to go over, I'd be glad to do that. Or if you have any questions that you think of as I'm talking, please jump in there. This is your review session, so I want you to get the most out of it. And the format of the test, you're probably curious about, it's going to be 40 questions, and I'm going to have multiple choice questions and true false and matching. So it's not going to be the essay format that you've had in the study guides. My tips are to have your study guides ready. So hopefully you can print them out and have them laid out in front of you from the 3 different chapters. Your textbook, you're welcome to use your textbook too. You have 90 minutes. So you have 90 minutes for 40 questions. So, you know, it's not an enormous amount of time, but it should be a comfortable amount of time. But you want to walk into that prepared. You can't pause it when it's starting to go, so you just have to go with it. So please let anyone you know that lives with you what you're up to, and that you can't be interrupted, and get yourself a beverage and etc. Just make it a real comfortable situation for you. And you can do it anytime on Tuesday. You can actually do it 1 minute after midnight if you wish, or you can do it up until midnight of Tuesday night. So you have the flexibility on when you can take the exam. And it's through Proctorio, which means that it's going to be whatever's on your screen is going to be monitored. Your location is going to be monitored, making sure you're not working with somebody else. It's a way that we can have this happen where you can be tested off campus. And so it's going to give you all kinds of information and tell you it's going to shut down your other routes, your windows. And so it's kind of a little process, but then you're going to find yourself in the exam. So that's the logistics. Let me just pause for a second and see, can you visualize that? Do you have any questions about the exam itself?
I don't have any questions yet. Thanks.
Okay. All right. So we'll move on. So yeah, we've covered a bit of material. So I'm going to, in this, in an hour, cover, I think, some of the major points, I guess, that I'd like you to know. So where to put your emphasis on. So we talk about the tropics, of course, but where the tropics are changes over the period of time on this planet. And that has been larger than it is now, and also smaller, because the climate is not constant. So the Earth has been even more tropical than it is today. And this image here is from your book showing fossils of tropical leaves that they found in Denver, of all places, a place you would not think of when you're thinking about the tropics. But the fact that they exist there tells us that it was at one point a tropical climate. They've unearthed fossils of palm trees and crocodiles in what's now Alaska. So it's pretty fascinating. So it's just important to put that in perspective of where the tropics has changed over time. Of course, a lot of change over time, movement of continents, movement of lithospheric plates. So now let's just jump into the tropics here. Here we've got an enormously large leaf, which is one of the characteristics of the tropics is to have broad leaves, not all this one, all like this, of course. This is an understory plant, and so it's an adaptation that to capture more light, you can have a bigger leaf to, you know, kind of to capture that sunlight coming through, because notice how dark it is in this picture, because we're in the understory. And so it's everything above is shading. And so that is one thing that the vegetation has to deal with is the fact that it's actually dark, even though it might be solar, lots of solar energy hitting a habitat. It's being captured by the layers above. So large leaves. And then here's just a typical drawing of the layers of a tropical rainforest. And this is kind of a generic picture. It wouldn't be actually so distinct if you were to look at a forest. But anyway, for the purpose of this illustration, we've got the emergent layer. We've got occasional tree popping out and taller than the rest. And the adaptation there, of course, would be able to capture that sunlight. But most of the vegetation and most of the life, most of the action is happening here in the canopy, which is continuous, if you notice, and even tied together in some respects with the vines that are wrapped around it. And so there's just a massive, dense vegetation. This is where you're going to find your fruits and your flowers mostly, and of course, things that live off of and pollinate those. So a lot of life here. Lower down, we have the understory. We have shorter trees that would be here. And then down by the forest floor, where it's darkest yet, like the picture we just saw, and most humid too, because the humidity would stay here. It only receives about 2% of the sunlight down here, amazingly. Down on the forest floor, you'll find more herbaceous plants. It's soft stem plants, not woody stems. And then below would be the soil, and the soil not necessarily very rich, because the nutrients of tropical rainforest are actually in the vegetation, in the life itself, and not much, because they're very quickly grasped and utilized again. Probably know what this one's called, drip tips, and it's an adaptation to help the water run off of the leaves, so the leaves are less likely to decay and less likely for nutrients to leach out. So moving the water quickly off the surface of the leaf. And that's a characteristic of rainforest plants, having drip tips. These are epiphytes, another characteristic, and they're plants that live on plants. They're usually not harmful or parasitic unless they get so many that the weight is simply a burden. But actually, in some cases, the trees can actually benefit from the epiphytes because they can grow roots within the mossy mats that can form here, so they can actually get nutrients from the plants that are living on them. Many different types of epiphytes, even in this picture are so many, but it's estimated there are 28,000 different species of epiphytic plants. And that is a characteristic of tropical rainforest. Now, occasionally trees do fall, and what's created is a forest light gap, as you can see here. And so that's an opportunity. It's the succession that happens here is a light gap will occur, and then underneath here you'll have a jungly type of growth, and then eventually just a few trees will actually make it, and then they'll shade what's below, and so it'll go from thick jungle to a shaded forest where there isn't such thick vegetation. Vines are very common. This is a woody vine called a liana. It's just a classification of vines. And they start as shrubs in a light gap, and they can remain rooted to the ground, but then they will reach up with their tendrils and climb up to trees, wrapping around in many cases, trying to reach, of course, the light, because that's the limiting factor. Then they can drape down, and they can form helixes which shows the winding around motion. So liana is a woody vine. And then here is an epiphyll, just like our homepage for this week. Epiphyll is plants that live on the leaves of plants, plants that live on plants instead of plants that live on trees, like epiphyte. And these can be lichens and mosses. Algae can grow as epiphylls. And here is the epiphytic mat I was referring to earlier. If you have a lot of epiphytes growing, then the bodies of them can serve, as they decay, they can serve as a substrate, so creating soil. So with time, you would get a buildup of a padded mat of vegetation, the epiphytic mat. The leaves of the epiphytes take up water. That's their adaptation. So obviously they can't have roots to the ground to pick up water, so they're going to get it right from the air. You find these more in cloud forests, moist cloud forests. But you can find a whole community here living in the epiphytic mat. We've talked about where the tropics are, between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. So this is where the sun is hitting most directly to create tropical habitats, which include, we've talked about rainforests and cloud forests, but also wet forests and moist forests and savannas, especially in Africa, Australia. You'll find savannas, which are grasslands. What you find where this has been a diagram to help predict what vegetation could be found where, and it has a very strong predictive value if you know a few things. So this, of course, is a Holdridge diagram. So the things that you would need to know are the annual precipitation for a particular area. You would need to know the biotemperature, which is the average temperature of an area. And then you also would need to know the potential evapotranspiration rate ratio, which is a mouthful. Evapotranspiration is with the potential for evaporation, how much water could evaporate, and the ratio is with respect to the amount of precipitation. So the potential evapotranspiration rate really is an indicator of how humid the ecosystem is. So you can think of water coming in through precipitation and then water leaving by evapotranspiration. And so by looking at this diagram, you can get a sense of how humid an environment is with those combinations in mind. So you're going to find more evapotranspiration when you are in an area that receives more direct light, because things dry up very quickly, of course, in a lot of sunlight, direct light. So there is a correlation between potential evapotranspiration and how close one is to the equator, where it would be very high, lots of evaporation. And there is also a correlation with temperature and where you are on the planet too, with temperature being highest at the tropics and coolest in the poles. This diagram takes that into account, but it also, it's a busy diagram, huh? It also correlates the altitudinal belts, because as you know, as you go higher up a mountain, it's cooler and cooler and cooler, and so the temperature will decrease. And so with this diagram, if you know the annual precipitation, the potential for evapotranspiration, and the temperature, you can follow these three guidelines and fall into one of these areas. And given that information for any particular system, you can predict, well, it's a moist forest, or, oh, it's going to be a rainforest, or it will be a desert. So looking at the potential evapotranspiration ratios, the smaller the number, the less potential evapotranspiration ratio, the more moisture is going to be around. The higher potential for evapotranspiration, the less moisture, the more evaporation that's happening. And so you can see by these high values that you get quite a bit of desert. And desert could be in the tropical areas or in the cooler boreal. So it's just a lot of evaporation is causing desert environment. But if you have a smaller value for potential evapotranspiration, you're going to have less evaporation and more moisture. And if you combine that with high precipitation, bingo, you've got the rainforest and wet forest. So I know I'm elaborating quite a bit on this, but I just thought maybe it would be a point that wasn't clear for some people. So I just wanted to, do you have any questions?
I don't have any questions.
All right, so hopefully that diagram is a bit clearer. And now taking a look at this figure from your book, it shows you that you can have two locations in the tropics that have very similar latitudes, so very similar temperatures, but very different habitats. Like Darwin, Australia, if you go there, that's a tropical savanna or grassland. But you go to Singapore, well, the parts that aren't developed with buildings and such, it's tropical rainforest. And even though the amount of rainfall can be very similar, it's in the distribution of the rainfall that's going to affect. And we see that when in the tropics, there are seasons, usually not referring to temperature, which is pretty darn consistent. Look at that. The seasons would refer to wet and dry. And you can see that here it's pretty wet year-round, whereas in a tropical savanna, it gets very dry. And so it's going to affect the plant life there. And so you're not going to get forests there. You get grasslands. This is a figure from your book, and it's to discuss why it's so wet. We know it's warm in the tropics, but why wet? And with the sun hitting most directly on, the sun's light is most directly on the equator and just above and below, but most directly at the equator, it's going to cause a great deal of evaporation. And so if there's moisture there, and there's quite a bit, including the fact that there's a lot of ocean too at this latitude, you're going to have evaporation. You know, when the sunlight and water combined causes evaporation of the water, and that's going to cause then the water to rise. But you probably know, deep space is cold. So the higher you go up away from our Earth, planet Earth, it gets cooler. And so now the warm, wet air that has risen then is cooling off, and then that causes rain. And so we have a lot of lifting and dropping of the water, especially around the equator. And so it just makes conditions that are ideal for tropical growth, lots of sun and lots of rain. And it's funny that we are now at the fall equinox today. Happy fall. So we can see that today the tilt of our planet with respect to the sun is like so, where the southern hemisphere is going to be getting more sun. But I just wanted to use this diagram to point out the fact that in the tropics receive sunlight no matter what, or about 12 hours of sunlight no matter what time of year. So unlike us, where our day length lengthens or shortens depending on the season, it's not so with the equator, because the sun shines most directly on at the equator no matter the time of year. And the day length is just about 12 hours at the equator, and move farther from it and it gets slightly longer or shorter. Okay, switching topics here, talking about ways that tropical rainforests in particular can experience destruction. And this is an example of logging roads. And might go in originally just for a tree or so, but one road leads to another road, you can see here. And unfortunately, when there's easy access to trees, then there's deforestation. That's a typical pattern of a deforested area. This is a hurricane, effect of a hurricane. There are natural ways that storms, that trees come down, and unnatural ways, like the logging we saw earlier, or here, clearing and burning. And unfortunately, that's a way that people can make use of the land for extracting oil or cattle farming or soy plantations. And so the burning of forests is unfortunately a problem. You're probably hearing about it in the news. So where are the tropical forests? The most remaining tropical forests are in the neotropical realm, which is central in South America. And you can see the biggest swath here, the largest unbroken stretch remaining, and about half of the world's tropical forests are in South America, in particular Brazil. And a quarter of them are in the Afrotropical realm. And then the remaining part are sorry, I meant to mention the Congo Basin, in particular the Congo Basin of the Afrotropical realm. And then the remaining parts are in Indonesia and various islands. Now, we have such an emphasis on tropical rainforests because they have the vast majority of the species of life on the planet. 50% of the species on planet Earth are in these areas that you see here. So they don't make up, they just make up 13% of the land cover, but have disproportionate 50% of the species that live in them. So here's probably a moist or dry tropical forest. And what we're seeing here is deciduous trees. It makes the most sense for trees to drop their leaves if they are in one of those dry seasons I was talking about, because of the strong amount of sunlight, which would cause a lot of evaporation if the leaves were there. If the leaves are dropped, then the tree is more protected from that. So deciduous in the dry season. And here's a savanna, another tropical system. It's really a grassland because grasses will predominate. And you'll find savannas in areas where you have less precipitation and higher amount of evapotranspiration than in the areas where you find tropical rainforests. Okay, switching topics again. Let me just pause and see if you have any questions or thoughts. All right, so this is shows the centers of origin for sea snakes in particular. It's the example we used in class. But this is the topic of biogeography. And biogeography is the study of what lives where on the planet. And if you want to understand the distribution, you know, why are there so many sea snakes here and hardly any, you know, in other locations, it's proposed that that has to do with its evolutionary past. And when sea snakes, for this particular example, first evolved, that would be in this location. And so over time, what evolution does is it causes the ability of variation, and some of the variations are selective advantages, and enough differences accumulate, and you've got new species. And so you would see species generated from that origin, the center of origin. And so you'd have the greatest number of species where that organism had first evolved. And so the distribution pattern has to do with the fact that there's going to be greatest diversity and concentration where they first evolved, and then you'll find less as you get further away, less types of species and less density. And biogeography, we also talked about the sweepstakes route using Galapagos Islands as an example, and the fact that some of the species on the Galapagos you find only there, meaning that they have had a long evolutionary history. And being that the Galapagos Islands are off the continent of Africa, and the continent of Africa is much, much, much older than the Galapagos Islands, pretty recent, that the organisms that you find on the Galapagos originated from Africa, but how they get there, this is a bunch of animals taking the water route, being on rafts of vegetation. It could be, you know, in the case of birds, that they fly or get blown off course. But sweepstakes route refers to the fact that it's a real long shot because of the distance traveled, and the chances that an organism would be unsuccessful are much greater than them being successful, like winning a sweepstakes. That sweepstakes route is indicating that a small chance, but it happened in some cases. And then once the predecessors of these animals came over to the Galapagos, then they are there, and not many others would come because it's such a rare event that, and so they'll populate and go their own evolutionary route. So biogeography really can only be understood in light of the fact that there is plate tectonics that have happened and are happening on the planet. So continents were adjacent to each other that are no longer adjacent any longer. And this is a continuous process. The Hawaiian nene is proposed that it was a descendant of a Canada goose that was blown way off course and made its way to Hawaii. And because it's such a rare event, that they were able to go their own evolutionary path with their own random mutations and own adaptations, and eventually becoming distinctive enough that they are their own species. So yeah, we're talking a lot about evolution. To understand any biology, of course, you have to understand it in light of the fact that things are evolving. Natural selection is the force that causes evolution, and the fact that species will overproduce, generally creating more offspring that can survive. And in the offspring, there is variation because of mutation. A mutation changes the genetic code, and some mutants are going to be helpful, some are not. It really depends. There's no way to predict what's going to be helpful. it's random, the mutation event. And so the ones that are more suited, maybe they have better eyesight, they're faster, they're better at digesting, live longer. You know, it could be a number of different things that occur just randomly through a mutation. And so through natural selection, the ones that are best suited to their environment will survive and thrive. And best suited to their environment, it could be having a really strong beak. We're now looking at finches from the Galapagos Islands. And strong beak's great when there's an abundance of hard seeds, or having a really pointy beak, like in this cactus ground finch, would allow in an environment where there's a lot of cactus for it to be able to thrive. So you really can't understand the adaptation unless you understand the environment with which that organism is living. Here's different Galapagos tortoises, and the adaptations are different because the vegetation on these islands is different. Here on this Hood Island, most of the grasses are gone, and what's available now are cacti that the turtle can only access by reaching up. And so in this particular island, because the vegetation there, it makes sense that tortoise that had the mutation for this long neck and a shell that allows the neck to go up, for this to predominate. Adaptations can be, I've been talking a lot about structural adaptations like necks and beaks and such. Those are physical adaptations like necks and beaks, or in this armadillo, having this armor, bands of horn and bone protects them from predators. Its coloration is also a physical adaptation because it can blend into the scrubby grassland. But adaptations can be behavioral too. And for the armadillo, if you ever seen one, they can roll up in a ball and protect their sensitive undersides. So it would allow it be better adapted if it had that behavior. We also talked in class about how sometimes it's not clear what the adaptation would be. You know, why would there be such a large amount of people, especially in certain African countries, that have sickle cell shaped blood when it's not very good for transporting oxygen and can cause a great deal of discomfort to a person who has a sickle cell trait and sickle cell anemia. But you need to look at with respect to the environment, and in those countries there's a higher rate of malaria, and the organism that causes malaria, a protozoan, does not attack very well the sickle cell shaped blood cells. So this person actually could be well adapted, even though it might not seem it, because she'd be more likely to be resistant against malaria. So adaptation is a long process. It takes a long amount of time. And sometimes the events on Earth are much faster than that. And so you have an adaptation that would have made sense a long time ago, and then it's just still around, even though the reason that the adaptation came about is no longer relevant. That's what they suspect is true for this tree with thorns, because it's not really highly preyed upon. And maybe in the past, it was a defense against large mammals, which used to exist in more abundance in Central and South America. But the the thorns are still there, even though they're not really helping the tree today. That's any way that's known. And then this is a Guanacaste tree, and this is the fruit, and the fruit is building up at the base of the tree. Not very helpful, because what fruit is for is to be dispersed, to take those seeds away from under the shade of the parent. At one point, there were larger animals that probably were able to eat on this very large fruit, but no longer today, and so they're accumulating. So these are both examples of an ecological anachronism. That is, it's not relevant. You can't understand the adaptation now because the ecology has changed. So this is the Great American Interchange, and this was a rather large event that enabled mixing of the fauna, so sorry, the flora, no, I had it right first, the fauna, the animal life of North America and South America with one another. What formed was the Pan American Land Bridge about 3 million years ago. You can see it wasn't here, but about 3 million years ago there was the Pan American Bridge, and also with that some uplift, which allowed these continents to be adjacent, and a sea level drop. So the animals that couldn't pass before could now pass, and so that was a big biogeographical event. And so it was a big effect going from south to north with the capybara and terror bird, armadillo, glyptodont, they're no longer around, porcupines and sloths moved up into North America. And moving south were, from North America to South America, were skunks and peccaries and horses and dogs and saber-toothed cats and other cats and tapirs and camelids and deer, rabbits, tree squirrels, bears, gomphothere, elephant-like gomphothere, field mice. Anyway, much longer list. So there was much more of an impact on South America because of the greater number of types of animals that were able to move. And here's that saber-toothed cat. So this are the Hawaiian Islands. Again, this is actively still happening. There are new islands coming about. And these are volcanic. And the reason that the Hawaiian Islands are moving is because there's a plume or a hot spot that's bringing up magma and creating volcanic activity and volcanic rock that is being created. And so this lithospheric plate is moving over this hot spot. And so the islands of Kauai, for example, formed much longer ago than the most recent Hawaiian island, Hawaii, the mainland, main island, because of how the amount of time that's passed from the plate going over the hot spot. More time has passed for Hawaii. And the Hawaiian Islands, quite remote. But even though they're isolated, there is life there, and they're pretty young, evolutionarily speaking. It might not sound like it millions of years ago, but you know, compared to North America, it's quite young. And so it is inhabited by birds and bats, which are able to come or be blown over sweepstakes route again, getting to Hawaii. But reptiles, there are no native reptiles or amphibians because it would be harder for those types of animals to get there. So you might recognize this. This is the honey creeper, and the have come, excuse me, let me back up on that. There's all kinds of names here. So, excuse me. So this is the founder species that was probably blown off course or somehow landed in Hawaii. And from the original species that was able to come from the mainland, all of these species have evolved from it. And so the evolution of species is the result of mutations, which are random, but some mutations will turn out to be beneficial. And on this island, which was originally sparsely populated, not much competition, and whatever food resources are around, these organisms will take advantage of it. This one going more for insects and bird eggs. This one for nectar. You can see it's kind of built for that. So random mutations leading to variation, different body types. And what you're seeing here are the winners, the fittest, the ones that survived because they've got the features. Now, I just want you to be aware that the birds were not able to change their bills in a way to take advantage of the flowers. That's not possible because mutations are random, and an organism can't modify its DNA just to take a better advantage because it might be useful. They can only inherit DNA. And so not individuals that change, but populations will change. Populations that will have features. It will arise that populations that have features that are advantageous are going to do better. So there's variation in life, and that's what natural selection is drawing from, inherent variation. This is a physical variation in color that's kind of very graphic to show you, but variation can also be in the physiology and behavior. Some will be more successful than others. Once again, talking about how nature produces more young than are able to survive. Okay, so now let's talk about some different types of roots. These are buttress roots, and this is an adaptation. No matter what realm you're talking about, you can find rainforests with buttress roots because this is a formula that works. It's a success story for this tree. They allow stability, as you can see here. As you can imagine, a nice stable base, nice stable support for this tree. Spreading out to, the soil is pretty nutrient poor, so spreading out to as much soil as possible to get as much nutrients as possible. Another one for stability in more moist areas, floodplains and stuff, would be these prop roots, because the water could just go right through. And so it is another stable structure, but it is in areas that get flooded. Another thing that you'll find world-round in tropical forests are orchids. And orchids are mostly epiphytes. They are, there's thousands of kinds of orchids. And they have various scents, different smells, shapes, and they are to allure the pollinator, because plants are very heavily dependent upon being pollinated to pass their genes from one to the other. Another common plant form in tropical rainforests are vines. And vines are known for, their ability to climb up with their tendrils to try and reach sunlight. So it's a formula that works. And the vines start on the forest floor and climb as far as they can. Now this is a heavy epiphyte. This is a strangler fig. And strangler figs are interesting because they'll actually start in the crown of the tree, and seed will either drop or an animal's droppings. An animal eats a seed and it's dropped to the ground. But a seed from this strangler fig somehow made it to the ground, and from that plant grew, and the plants will then excuse me, started in the tree. So they get this correct. So strangler fig started as an epiphyte. It started in the tree crown, and then from animal droppings. Oh, okay, I had it backwards. Okay, scratch that. So how strangler figs work is that the plant starts in the tree, and it gets to the tree from a seed that was deposited by an animal. And then from that, it would create tendrils and send out thin roots that will then reach the ground. And then these can fuse and intertwine, and they mesh, and eventually will form their own root system and grow more substantial. And so in this case, they would not allow the tree underneath to grow any further. And that's why they call them strangler figs. And also it's going to be shading the tree. And so eventually the tree can't grow, can't receive light. And what you find sometimes in the tropics is that the tree then dies, and you can only see the remains of this cage outside the strangler. So this is a rainforest diagram to show that rainforests are very similar in their appearance. The life forms that we've talked about, you know, the epiphytes, ferns, strangler figs, these are common in different types of forests, because these are the adaptations that result when you have what environmental conditions? When you have high temperature, high humidity, and abundant rainfall. And so these forms excel in that situation, capturing as much of the light and rain as possible. Pollination is very important among the tropical rainforest plants, because how else would the pollen from one plant be able to reach the eggs from another plant? There's very little wind within the forest itself, so the pollen is not blowing there. And so the plants rely upon their pollinators, and they don't want it to be random. They want the pollinator to be very specific and bring it to another plant of that same species. And so in order to do that, will attract their, entice their particular pollinators, whether it be with a nectar or a scent or a shape that looks particularly alluring. So this is what we're talking about here is sexual reproduction, and how plants are able to do it is it's facilitated by animals. And successful would produce fruits, because a pollinated flower, then it would develop into a fruit. And within those fruits are a variety of seeds. And so you're looking at seeds here. And the seeds are what then the next generation of plant would come from. And so in order to get the seeds to a location other than right below their parent plant, which would be good and shade them, they're placed into fruits. And so the purpose of these fruits is not to be delicious things for humanity to eat. The purpose of these fruits are to bring the seeds, to entice animals to bring the seeds to another location, basically. So animals have a role as dispersers. But we are very dependent upon a lot of the foods you can see here. Maybe you've eaten one of these today. We're very dependent upon the fruits that have come from tropical rainforests. Okay, so that's my last slide. Oh, we're finishing up right on time. Cool. So I just want to recap that the more preparation you have before that exam begins, the better off you'll be. If you understood the stuff that I've talked about in this lecture, then I think you're in great shape. And if you have those notes available for you and the text, I think that you'll do fine. Do want to mention that you, of course, have the other 100-point project, and that is your species profiles. And so the fact that they're both due tomorrow, at least by midnight. So I just want to make sure you ration your time so you can do well on both of those. Is there anything else? Any questions that you have?
I'm good, thank you.
I really appreciate you coming.
Okay, thanks.
Otherwise, I would have just been talking to myself.